The very concept of wildlife conservation is recent. It only appeared when we stopped being directly dependent upon nature for our sustenance. After having drawn away from it, after having abused it, we finally realized that it was time to preserve this irreplaceable wealth.
In Europe, more than on other continents, the ascendancy of man over nature is age-old and massive. At the end of the 19th century, the United States instituted the first national park at Yellowstone.
It's in Scandinavia, in the northern countries, that can be found the last of the large, wild, unexploited territories of Europe. And that's where the first of Europe's national parks were born.
Sweden became a forerunner by creating 9 parks at once in 1909. Their names are Sarek, Abisko, Garfitan.
In 1914, before Iceland, Spain, and Finland, Switzerland in its turn created its first national park, an alpine park.
The ibex herds of Gran Paradiso testify to a previous idea of wildlife preservation. They owe their survival to the magnanimous decision of a single hunter, Emmanuel II, King of Italy, who, as if suddenly struck by grace, imposed absolute protection of his reserve.
The protection of nature no longer depends upon selfishness or privilege. It is structured around a simple idea, the necessity of preserving and sharing a collective heritage that is both fragile and unique. Established in 1963, the La Vanoise National Park borders for 14 kilometers on the French side the Italian park of Gran Paradiso. Together, these high mountain parks cover 100,000 hectares and form the largest national reserve of Western Europe. The park protects more than 1,000 varieties of flowers and many animals such as chamois and marmots.
Here, as in all parks, conservation covers the mineral, vegetal, and animal realms. La Vanoise, with its 500 kilometers of marked trails and 20 overnight refuges, is a paradise for hikers and photographers. Upkeep and maintenance is carried out to facilitate exploration, on condition that nature does not suffer from it.
In natural parks, in return for accepting to comply with a few varying restrictions, we are given the chance to experience nature in its unspoiled magnificence. This French park is among the 200 national parks that can be found between the Atlantic Ocean and the Ural River. Each park has its own distinct organization and ambition.
Musk oxen, which had all but disappeared from Europe, were reintroduced in Norway in the large park of Dovrefjeld. At Bielovieja, where a few scraps of our primal forest subsist, we can find the last bison of the continent. Apart from these spectacular large national parks, Europe boasts almost 15,000 protected areas.
We're entering one of the large wildlife sanctuaries of Europe, the largest protected area of the whole Iberian Peninsula. Wolves and wild bulls were plentiful here once, and what formerly were private royal hunting grounds is now a large national park.
The park's fame is closely linked to the tragic destiny of a young lady in the 16th century, the daughter of the Princess of Eboli, Dona Anna. Dona Anna disappeared in the thickets here, never to be seen again. Since that day, this area, previously called the Royal Grove, was named after her.
The 50,000 hectares of the Great Spanish Park are located in the extreme south of the European continent. It is not far from Seville, in the province of Huelva, that one finds the enchanted land of Donana. This part of the Spanish coast has long sandy beaches bordering the Atlantic, and the ocean characterizes this park, which stretches from the west to the east, from the coast to the shores of the Guadalquivir River.
This distinctive location between the sea and a large river creates exceptional conditions.
The very special nature of the Donana area is the product of long evolution. In primeval geological eras, the mouth of the Guadalquivir was an enormous estuary. The formation of a coastal sandbar ended up by isolating a huge stretch of water. In Roman days it was called Lake Ligustinus. This shallow lake was gradually filled in by alluvial deposits and became a swamp.
Even today, Donana's landscape keeps changing. A western wind blows perpendicular to the coastline, sweeping up silica from the immense rings of dunes which border the shore. Inexorably, the sand creeps up along the pine forest, encircling and smothering it. These great mobile dunes create spectacular scenery, which was described in 1910 in a book by Chapman and Buck called Unexplored Spain.
To the west are revealed vast vistas of Saharan desert with kilometer upon kilometer of shining sands, totally devoid of any vegetation. Oh, the exaltation of magnificent desolation, the splendor of sterility.
Except for the softened contours of its dunes, Donana offers only flat stretches of land, a succession of varied landscapes of contrasting vegetation, an astonishing patchwork of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems.
Donana is the host to an extraordinary wealth of wildlife. Being near the Straits of Gibraltar, it is one of the main stopping places for the great bird migrations between Europe and Africa. Hundreds of thousands of birds come to spend the winter here. More than 150 species visit the park.
Since their origin, the swamps of Guadalquivir, being inhospitable to men, have been a privileged enclave for the animals of the region, especially birds.
Despite its renown, despite the fact that it is a recognized part of Spanish heritage, the great painter Goya, for example, visited it in the 18th century. Despite having been the object of many studies and scientific expeditions, this natural treasure was menaced in the 1950s.
In 1959, some private companies, as well as some departments of the Spanish government, undertook to drain the swamps, threatening to destroy the unique ecosystems. International wildlife preservation societies immediately mobilized, particularly the World Wildlife Fund, for which this was one of the first urgent cases. It's thanks to them that the processes started which led to the creation of the Donana National Park in 1969. Today, the park attracts visitors from around the world who set out on their visit of Donana from the La Rosina and the Acebuche visitor centers.
Donana is explored with the help of organized visits. We'll pass lagunas, dunes, cross pine forests, and the infamous thickets. In this fashion, however, we've little chance of coming upon the two treasures of Donana, the lynx and the little Spanish mongoose, unique in Europe and called the meloncello.
During the wet season, when the swamp is flooded, the best way to visit the park is by horse. Huts have been put up which constitute excellent observation posts all year round.
Numerous flocks of wild, migrating geese stop off at Donana from northern Europe. Here there are more than 70,000 birds. These geese are the ancestors of our domestic geese. Males and females have the same coloring. They form couples that remain together for life.
The severe drought of the summer of 1981, the worst in a century, took many casualties among the flocks of geese. 15,000 of them died. When the sun is high, during the hottest months, the park wavers between desert and savanna.
Barreling through these pristine landscapes in a four-wheel drive vehicle seems almost sacrilegious. Yet paradoxically, it is only in this context that it is possible to both open the park to the public and preserve the environment. There are strict rules, and no one is allowed to tread the sands beyond 3 or 4 meters from the trail.
The animals have become used to this rumbling and display uncommon behavior. They don't seem to be at all disturbed by the passing vehicles. But if one of them stops to allow a closer view of the animals, the engine must be left running. If it stops, the animals interpret it as an unusual event and flee.
The biological preserve, situated at the historic center of the park, its very heart, is a true sanctuary. A statue of a lynx, Donana's emblem, guards the entrance. This area is off limits to tourists and is visited only by scientific expeditions. Donana's wildlife flourishes here under optimal protection.
The park strives to maintain several couples of imperial eagles, but the splendid birds of prey are scarce in the Donana sky. It's more common to come upon royal kites, but it's best not to disturb the birds, especially during the nesting period.
Despite the wealth of animal life in the park, it is only with patience and discretion that we can experience some precious moments.
To those with less patience, the exploration of Donana might seem too monotonous, too partial, or too regulated. Tours are guided, private cars are especially forbidden, movements are limited and restricted to specific parts of the park. But this is only because Donana is anxious to preserve its enchanted land.
A 1,000 kilometers northeast of Donana, nature, with the watchful assistance of man, has another little miracle in store for us.
The little island of Port Cros is located in the Mediterranean Sea, about 15 kilometers off the French coast. It's one of the 3 islands which make up the little archipelago of the Ile de Hierro. Measuring only 4 kilometers by 3, it's the smallest. Also the most mountainous, and a pleasant surprise in this region, which, although magnificent, is unfortunately often disfigured by developers.
Just a few minutes by boat from the coast with all its bustle and agitation, Port Cros is like another world, a world that has remained natural and human. Cars are forbidden on the island, which has about 40 inhabitants, mostly fishermen.
This little jewel of an island set in the Mediterranean was a much sought-after prize, and it has remained such a paradise thanks only to the foresight of the owners, who willed it to the French government.
The island is covered with scrubs and green oak and alpine forests. It slopes gently from the south towards the north, where sit the bays, the port, and the little village.
In 1963, Port Cros became both a land and underwater national park. With its 1,800 hectares of preserved seascape, it's the first park of its kind in Europe and in the Mediterranean.
Many attempts to conquer the island were made in the last 2,000 years, and several forts remain to bear witness to its turbulent history. The archive reproductions of these buildings seem to show that the island was all but barren of vegetation until the last centuries. Poets say that Port Cros is made of water and golden shale. Geologists say it is all schist and mica schist. Broken, laminated or folded, strips, slivers, and leaves of rocks.
In the southern part of the island, where the cliffs drop off to the sea, we come upon this strange limestone sculpture. It turns out to be a fossilized dune, dating back several dozen thousands of years to when this little piece of land was still attached to the mainland. Its present isolation has indeed made Port Cros a land apart, a land where the sea reigns, and where we are encouraged to explore the depths. The easiest way of admiring the underwater kingdom is by taking a short cruise on one of these unusual glass-bottom boats.
Because of the transparency of the water, sunlight penetrates deep into the ocean, allowing plants to perform photosynthesis. From the surface to a depth of 40 meters, we can find a lush herbatorium of Posidony, an underwater plant which already inhabited the seas 60 million years ago.
Posidony is only found in the Mediterranean, where it has always been prized for its many properties. In Italy, fresh Posidony leaves are added to chicken feed to improve the quantity and weight of eggs. In Venice, it's used for wrapping glassware. In Egypt, shoes are made of it, and it's said to be an excellent remedy for a sore throat.
Posidony is one of the great riches of the Mediterranean. These herbatoriums are the underwater equivalent of our forests. They produce enormous amounts of oxygen. They provide shelter, spawning grounds, and food for fish.
The Park of Port Cros offers many ways of exploring this magnificent and fragile domain. There's even an underwater trail which one swims along with a mask and snorkel, accompanied by an instructor.
On the surface, a botanical trail helps us appreciate the beauty of the land part of the park. Spring is the best season to enjoy the flora of the island. Because all forms of underwater fishing are strictly forbidden here, Not only has original marine life been regenerated, but new species have turned up to take refuge in these hunter and pollution-free waters.
The park administration is attentive in maintaining a natural balance in this fragile environment and constantly diagnoses the situation. The results have been encouraging beyond hope, demonstrating the capacity of nature to self-regenerate, provided it's preserved from further harm.
More experienced divers won't resist the temptation to dive a few meters down to the wreck. These waters are rich in groupers, corbs, and saberfish, but the most spectacular inhabitants of this rusting carcass are without doubt the conger eels.
Falcons, blackbirds, and swifts spend the winter in these cliffs. In the spring, many migrating species stop off at Port Cros for a short rest before continuing their journey north. But in summer, only the species that nest here, such as seagulls, remain.
In order to maintain such a quality of environment, to preserve its biological diversity and richness, it is unfortunately not sufficient to let nature take its course. The park needs rigorous and willful management. Surveillance, upkeep, research, and protection at Port Cros is carried out by a staff of 50. It's a complex task, for it entails both a land and an underwater environment, in a region with a high concentration of tourism.
Port Cros becomes more crowded in summer. Launches from the mainland bring tourists who come for day trips. This popularity creates problems and could end up compromising the quality of the environment. Visitors are asked to respect rules based on common sense and regard for nature. Camping is not allowed, and due to the fire hazard, especially when the powerful Mistral wind blows, smoking is forbidden outside the village.
The underbrush has been cleared in selected areas to further reduce the risk of fire in this sun-seared little Mediterranean forest. But another danger menaces the island. The appealing shores attract many small boats, almost to the point of saturation. The scraping of the anchors damages the sea bottom, and irresponsible littering leaves up to 2 tons of garbage per hectare.
Although divers come across barren, littered ocean floors and scraggly herbatoriums everywhere else in the Mediterranean, the sea at Port Cros retains the beauty of a tropical ocean. The thriving of the Posidony, which, regardless of its vitality, is very fragile, is a good indicator of the quality of the park's environment. Elsewhere, it's receding due to pollution, portuary activity, and other human abuse. Here, it's an oasis of life.
The water here is not as clear as at Port Cros, but just as nourishing, with its abundance of exuberant vegetation. We are at the heart of a natural environment unique in Europe, in the largest delta on the continent, the Danube Delta.
The Danube Delta in Romania in Eastern Europe stretches over 5,000 square kilometers. It is 80 kilometers wide at the spot where the Danube River plunges into the Black Sea after a journey of almost 3,000 kilometers.
The land of the Delta is a strange one, bustling with life, a complex and changing land with an intermingling of water and swamp ground, where the earth is never really firm, where the river hesitates, creating countless branches and ramifications before finally choosing its course towards the sea.
As with Donana, the geographical location, the expanse, and the complexity of the environment encourage an extraordinary diversity of wildlife unique in Europe. From an ornithological point of view, the Delta is unique in the world, with more than 250 species present. One can find birds from Northern Europe, Asia, Africa, Iran, India. Midway between the North Pole and the equator, it must represent a sort of ideal stopover for migrating birds. This secret and often impenetrable world offers the feathered population ideal conditions in which to live and love.
Large cormorants abound in the delta. They're big eaters, downing several kilos of fish per day. as are the pelicans, who fish in groups. The tufted heron's technique is different, but effective.
The sheer quantity of birds and the size of their appetites, especially those of the cormorants and the pelicans, means that they consume tons of fish every day, and this has caused the human inhabitants of the delta to question their protection.
The delta itself is not a national park, although it does include 3 large natural reserves. It benefits, however, from a principle of systematic protection of its wildlife. The whole region is a protected natural area where hunting is strictly forbidden.
Fishing is allowed all year round, except for a 60-day period when the fish lay their eggs. Fishing is vital for many of the people who live here.
Fishermen were less than keen when measures were set to protect cormorants. They find that these birds are too numerous, too skilled at fishing, and therefore represent unfair competition.
Judging from the contents of the returning skiffs, the water still seems well stocked in fish. 110 species have been identified, with 36 specific to the delta. Among the bream and carp, the catfish looks gigantic.
One may be content with a good catch of pike or crayfish, but for the fishermen here, there is but one supreme fish, the king of all fish, the one found in the front part of the delta, the saltwater part, the one that measures over 2 meters, His Majesty the sturgeon.
The delta is a fragile system, and the work being carried out here, although it may seem a bit crude, is intended to preserve it. The banks need to be stabilized. Since ancient times, the Danube has been a busy thoroughfare. The small tributaries and large channels are like the many roads of a vital network, where all sorts of crafts provide the only possible means of transportation.
Each year, the Danube hauls 50 tons of alluvium into its delta. That's 8 times more than the Tiber and 20 times more than the Rhine. This suspended alluvium deposits little by little and is progressively colonized by vegetation, gradually taking on a characteristic form called shore. The major part of the delta is covered with thick reeds, but poplars, willow, ash and aldus also grow on the banks.
Every year, 40 meters of land is added to the delta. The Romanians say that it's the youngest land in Europe. Nonetheless, if the delta keeps getting more and more bogged down in silt and mud, its fragile ecosystem will be in danger. It appears that the recent surge in interest by tourists will encourage authorities to undertake protective measures.
Tourists visit the delta almost exclusively on specially fitted launches, which follow itineraries designed to give a faithful view of the life of the delta. It is forbidden by law to cross the delta alone on a private boat. Any regrets fade, however, when one sees the incredible labyrinth composed of tributaries of the Danube, lagunas, channels, swamps and such. Without a guide, it's impossible not to get lost.
In order to combat poaching, which particularly menaces otters, volunteer guards regularly patrol the delta. They who know the beauty and mystery of the delta so well try to instill in others the understanding of the necessity to preserve animals and the environment.
Whether or not the Danube is polluted is questionable. All of the pollution collected by the river upstream appears to be literally digested by the extraordinary natural power of transformation of the delta's ecosystem. In Romania, pelicans, tufted herons, and swans are called monuments of nature. It's a quaint way of expressing the respect these birds inspire and the protection they deserve.
Article 32 in the Romanian Code of Law concerns the protection of the environment.
Will not be deployed within the perimeter of the reserves any activity which might provoke the destruction or the modification of the original aspect of the location, of its wildlife, or of the ecological balance.
It is vital that a universal understanding be reached, so that nature, our most precious treasure, be preserved for future generations.